So what I thought would make a lot of sense today is to try to see where this has all taken us. And so I'll put myself on the line first and try in the first hour to kind of make a personal statement about all of this as I've gone through the material and raise a couple of questions. And then we'll open it up for a larger discussion. I want to hear how you're doing. So in other words, my discussion now is not to close the discussion, but just to indicate how I'm thinking about the issue at this point. And I'll take us through, just for the sake of clarity, some reflections on the various readings that you did, and then hopefully you'll come in with either agreement or disagreement among the various. So the question that I begin and I was posing is, how is it with us and sorrow? How do we stand in relationship to the sorrow of things? With a consciousness of the horror and the emptiness or the vacuity, how do we stand in relationship to incommensurable senselessness? That we can't correlate between actions and results. How do we stand in relationship to the monstrousness of mendacity, of evil, and the depravity of the world, which raises our consciousness towards God in relationship to this. So the question then is, how is it with us when we hear this? And when I say with us, I really mean perhaps us around the table. I don't mean everybody else. I had this very shocking experience yesterday driving down, listening to NPR, and there was a BBC reporter describing some of the most horrible depravities taking place now in the Central Republic of Africa. And I realized, that there are things that are going on that can only be handled by the greatest amount of force and resistance and law. And so I say, how is it with us? I'm talking about people like us who are reflecting on these painful things with a minimum amount of power, but we live within a world that we're trying to reflect on. So I'm not answering it for anybody. Right after I heard that report, there was a second report, right after they described all kinds of horrors going on in Syria, about some rap singer in Mexico who was reporting songs about the brutality that had result from the drug war. And these horrors of these mothers screaming and crying. And the person said, well, my rap song is not trying to fix this. I'm just describing it. And he said, there's only one reality, whether you have respect. And if the only way you have respect is with a Kalashnikov, that's the way you get respect. So I was just listening to that. I said, this is not my world. But this is the world. Right? So when I say, how is it with us, I'm saying with us who are a very peculiar fragment of the spectrum. And I'm not even going to try to make any kind of global statement, but how do I try to live with some level of decency and integrity and a limited amount of power within respect of this? And for me, these issues don't go away, but I have to keep some sense of proportion, and there are kinds of evil and depravity that are not handled by my sympathetic understanding that they had a bad childhood, but that require the greatest amount of force of intervention to save life and restrict and all kinds of other things, which I perhaps would be a miserable person doing, but which have to be done. Okay? So that's what I mean. I mean, in the strongest sense, how is it for us? A very, very peculiar group in this world who are come to the university to try to deepen our humanity and we're reading these kinds of books, and we're trying to deepen our theological sensibilities, and we're not necessarily going to change an awful lot, but we're trying to cultivate something. So, what has the book of Job given us after all of this? Right? What is the experience of reading opened up that takes us a little farther than we were about 9 weeks ago? To humanize our spirit in new ways, or to affect our theological impulse. And I use that in a very restricted sense. So we have a theological impulse, right? I've often used the sense of a kind of a disposition. We have an impulse. We want to kind of see it a little bit larger than the pure natural world. We don't want to say more than we can say. And how is it with us? We're trying to say minimal things that have kind of maximal effect upon us. So I'm trying to really say, coming back to an earlier lecture, has our experience, my experience, rereading the book of Job and teaching it and listening, reading your papers, is there any new solace that this has given us? Is there any new wisdom? Is there a minimum that can open us up to stand on what Somerset Maugham called the razor's edge, if you've ever read his book on the razor's edge? You're kind of walking this very, very sharp balance point. But again, it's not for all of us. Is there any consolation that opens up new vectors? That's all I'm saying. Open up vectors without giving final answers. In all of this, because what I'm searching for, and what I would like to come to at the very end of this hour, is some minimal statement that keeps our theological integrity intact, and that doesn't try to answer what we can't answer, but without having, in the strong sense, of consolation, but in the sense some orienting consciousness, this orienting vector. You can't really live in a balanced way. You're trying to kind of keep, otherwise you're being swept along by the tide. So is there some type of thought that's a transcending thought, that is some kind of a consolation that says, this is the way I'm going to take my stand. You know, God help me. I'm going to pin that up on the wall of the gates, right? Here I stand, so help me God. This is my minimal thought, and this is the way I'm going to stand in the world, in a certain way. And then the last question. So the first question is, how is it with us in sorrow? The second question was, what has the book of Job given us? The third, is there any solace or new wisdom, some minimal new vector point? And the fourth, if Job is within Scripture, how can we return to scriptural traditions with a new consciousness? I assume that that's an issue that we're all facing. Does one have to stand aside, or can one return and stay within one's tradition, but now with a new or deeper consciousness? So I'm not going to answer this for everybody. I'm just going to try to give some statements. So by way of setting up where I want to go personally with this, let me just try to take some of the readings that you had for class today and make a couple of comments, not being judgmental about them, but simply trying to describe them as perhaps real options, and then raise a couple of questions about them. They're not all real options for me. I found some of them very offensive, but I want to try to give them the best kind of reading, because they may be real for you. I don't know. Okay? Yeah?
I was just wondering, can you particularly elaborate on the Nemo, on Levinas' response? That was really dense, and I was just wondering...
I'm going to try to come back to that. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. I think some of that will fold a little bit into my response, but I'm going to try to come back to that. So the first, maybe we'll pick up with the Nemo business, and maybe I'll make a comment about the Levinas here, but then come back to it. But then we'll come back to a much larger discussion. I just want to kind of take us through several stages towards my position, and then we can open up where these puzzlements really work for you. Okay? So, from the question, is there any solace or is anything that we've learned? What is one possibility? So one possibility, taking our cue from Nemo in the broadest sense, is to say that the real truth that you have to get your head around is evil. And evil, in the first and deepest sense for him, is to realize that it is excess as such. It's the fullness of excess. And it's the excess which is God, or the other. Hence, in some bizarre sense, that's my own personal thing, he calls evil God. So for him, the perception of the other, of everything that's intractable, of everything that resists technique, of everything that is beyond, is evil. And so it is the arc category. For him, and this is where he's partially inspired by Heidegger, but he goes in a very different direction than Heidegger, is that it opens up the most primal anxiety possible. Okay? And that primal anxiety does not throw us into a new consciousness of the nothingness of being, perhaps, in a more Heideggerian sense, but it opens us up to the true anxiety of trying to live in the face of the intractable, that everything is other. And it leads, I think, if I understand him correctly, to two kinds of consciousness. One consciousness is that if you truly integrate the anxiety of the other, which is the intractable, there is a birth in your soul. Something is born in you which makes you distinctive as a human being, which he calls soul. God, for him, is impotent. God is the intractable as such. Or God is holding back God's grace. Some will see some kind of a very strange Christian position he has. That God is holding God's grace back, and as the human being discovers soul, that is to say, comes to a consciousness of this evil, of this great otherness, something is born in the universe through that consciousness which is God. And we help by resisting the evil at the moral level, but still remaining aware of its intractability, somehow stand in this long, waiting horror, which is this consciousness of excess as such. For him, and here, in a certain sense, he's a kind of Marcionite, he juxtaposes law to grace. So for him, law, and he often uses it with a capital L, law becomes that which is the succumbing to technique. Whenever I think that I can control it, I turn to law. So he identifies the friends with law. And the mystery of Christ for him is at some moment corresponding to the fullness of this evil is some unknowable grace that will flood in, that we can only wait for at the end of time. Okay? Now he doesn't fully elaborate on that. Where Levinas takes a stand against that is that he says being aware of the intractable or the evil as such immediately puts me into a stance of humility in which I look around me and I see all the faces that make a claim upon me. And so my primary stance is not simply a stance of anxiety before the excess as such, but that when I realize, this is in some ways the way Levinas is dealing with this, although it's a very dense, confusing way that he formulates it. Part of it is the translations problem, but is that it's not just that the being is intractable, but I realize the intractability of all thought to think the intractable. In other words, I can't escape the categories of human mind. It's not just that things are intractable, because if things are just intractable, then I live within a state of permanent anxiety that I can never really get my head around things. For Levinas, there's a second consciousness of the intractability of the intractable, and when I integrate that, I'm thrown into a framework of responding to the things or the faces or the persons in the world that make claims upon me. And so that for him is more primary, and that is the true source of law. That the source of law arises out of a certain moral consciousness of looking at the neighbor in a new way when I realize that we are under this high dome of heaven that we can't understand, and that there's an intractability of the intractable. That's the language that the translator uses, so I'm using it in this case. And I see the face of the other, which opens me towards the great depth of transcendence that I would not have been aware of. The intractable keeps me somehow enclosed within a cognitive mindset, and the face of the other opens up a greater depth of moral action, and that becomes, as it were, the grace point or the grace note that is the source of the law. So that's a Jew speaking to a Christian who has taken a Marcionite position, right? That law is evil and grace is not yet, but it will counteract that, and we have to wait for it in anxiety, right? So he split the difference in a Marcionite way, Nemo, to some degree. Whereas Levinas is trying to find out of Nemo's argument some standpoint which is authentic to his theology, but which is also Jewish in a certain sense. That is to say, that the law is a healing mechanism within the excess. And as I'll try to show towards the end, it depends on what that inner standpoint is. So for Levinas, it's the face of the other, which becomes a conditioning of the transcendence of existence. I can't turn the other into an idol. The other, it always resists, makes claims upon me. And that opens me to a depth of care that's a different form of care of being in a Heideggerian sense, but it's a care that requires me to build a just society. Right? Law is born from that new loving consciousness for Levinas. He doesn't use loving consciousness, but I'm using that to counterpoint that Marcionite position. That you can see the danger of a Marcionite position. Right? Where grace is a truth, but grace is not yet, and law is evil, as if we were in some kind of Gnostic kingdom, that this is a world created by the evil God, whose name is Elohim, who is the God of the Old Testament, and is simply given law. And you have to wait for a liberation, which is grace, which is somehow beyond law, beyond anxiety, etc., wherever it is. But he doesn't deal with that. But he takes you, in a certain sense, into the psychic depth of Job to indicate that Job has seen, but the friends have not seen. He's seen that evil is a reality, but that is the other, that is God. And he resists the legal impositions, which he calls the frame. So for him, rationality or reason, etc., is a form of law. All right, let's leave Nemo for the time being in that sense. I want to try to recoup some of the insights of Levinas in a different way, in my own personal terms. But I think that's... So Levinas is gentle. And so he tried to take the best of Nemo and then turn it slightly on its head in its own way. But they couldn't be farther apart. I don't think they could be farther apart. Because in a certain sense, the anxiety of Nemo is not the anxiety of doing the right deed, which is a more Levinasian position. Right? There's a difference between the primacy of anxiety and the primacy of concern for the face of the other. I'm going to come back to some of that. So now, that's the first issue. So the question that I have jotted down here as a question towards Nemo in this particular sense, is excess truly evil? Is excess evil? Is that identification make any sense? And is anxiety and waiting for grace the only truth? Is there anything else to be done? Okay. But here you can see a very frightening inheritance of the Christian tradition, at least from my point of view. So then we come to Simone Weil. Sort of never was really Jewish, so you can't say she was a lapsed Jew. She was born into a assimilated home. There was one essay that Buber once wrote. If she only had any contact, she would have been different. But she never had. So she is who she is. Now, she raises a very, very different notion of this waiting and what you do in this world. And here I want to just try to spell it out as best I understand it. I think it is partially insane and partially brilliant in the combination between Greek tragedy and Catholicism. And let me just I think that's what she's trying to balance, but in a way that I think is highly idiosyncratic. And the question is, is that the real truth of Catholicism? But let me and so how much can you learn from this? It's her truth, so obviously it's a real thing, but so let me just try to spell out what I think she's saying. Well, she does say this, but hopefully my articulation will be fair to her. So she says, on the one hand, there is suffering in the world. And you shouldn't be surprised at suffering in the world. The world is a monstrous place. It's filled with blind necessity, blind power, force, and the human being is swept up into this in all kinds of ways. So we can feel suffering, and suffering is somehow more significant than pain because it's already some kind of a higher category. We'll say Soloveitchik also distinguishes between pain and suffering. But the real starting point for real theological insight is the notion of affliction. So affliction, as opposed to suffering, is when your world is destroyed. When you even deny God. Or you're in a sense of total despair. But somehow, in some way, you hold on to a deep truth of possibility. So for her, Job is a creature of affliction. His world is absolutely destroyed, but he holds on to what it seems to be tamim, some sense of integrity. Christ, for her, is also a figure of affliction, and that's why Christ on the cross calls to God, "Why did you abandon me?" God remains present in some level, but there's a feeling of enormous abandonment. That is a statement that arises out of affliction, when a world is psychically and spiritually destroyed. Now then she says, what is the truth of affliction from a theological point of view? The truth of affliction has to be understood now, and now she speaks as a Christian. God created the world in love. And the world that's created in love is love from the absolute apex down to the nethermost point of being. If God is one, and love embraces everything, it will embrace everything from the fullest to the most empty. It will cover the entire spectrum, including the enormous emptiness between the self at the lowest point and God who loves at the highest point. So even at the lowest point, there is still the consciousness that there is God who loves. The person who is able to understand that truth, that from top to bottom, and within the enormous distance and space of understanding, is love, experiences the entire world in all possibilities as a series of resonances of love. Because something is held out of that truth, and then this is the way I think she brings together the issue of Greek tragedy and the Catholic position. Blind necessity, the world of fatum, the world of fate, the world of force, the world of blind nature, is in truth God's providential love. She says it. That is one of the ways that God cares for being. God has created a world which includes this huge vastness of possibilities, not in our terms, but that is part of this providential care of love from top to bottom, but it's blind to human desire to shape it in personal terms. It's blind necessity. That's why she says This is one of the truths you can learn from the Iliad, and one of her greatest essays is on the Iliad. And what one can learn from the horrors of murder and killing in the Iliad from an artistic point of view. And then the point where this correlation comes of the Christian notion, it's not just that God creates in love, which you would only know as a Catholic, from a dogmatic point of view, not necessarily from the interior of the world of blind force, which is what you experience. So what does what does God do to get you, or what would be the truth of affliction? And here's where she uses, and I think I'm understanding it correctly. She then says, because I asked myself, why does she use the imagery that she uses? So affliction, she says, is like a nail. It's a nail that's hit by God, that pierces into the depths of your soul. And when it pierces into the depths of your soul as affliction, and you understand that hammer, which is God's force, God's providential love, as it were, that hits the hammer, the nail, which is the places of existence that pierce you and your soul, and you realize that point that penetrates your inner being is the force of God's wholeness and love for all of being, you have been nailed to the center of the cross. And then he says, that's why you are nailed to the vector of the cross. So there becomes a place where any person who comes to that consciousness, if I understand her correctly, recapitulates in some sense the affliction of Christ. And that's the awareness that all is love, but that there is an enormous emptiness and distance between God in God's loving at one point and the place where we often find ourselves in the world. And the affliction becomes this initiation into a Christian consciousness in this deepest sense. So in this blending of providence, faith, blind necessity as divine loving providence, and that the need to have this penetrate your soul like a nail on a cross into existence is an initiation into God's love, is some bizarre way of bringing together the tragedy, Greek tragedy, and Christian truth, so that the pagan and the Christian are saying the same thing in different ways, but they bring you to a new consciousness. So we have to wonder whether this is simply her personality, which is obviously a very profound, caring personality for what she did, but whether this has any spiritual sanity about it. Right, a couple of questions before we move on. It can be true and be idiosyncratic. She may have a true insight, but in a certain sense, you wouldn't come to this unless you're struggling to resolve tragedy and Christianity at the same time. You wouldn't come to this under any normal reading of Catholicism or any reading of... So it's... a couple of questions.
Yeah, but there's also with Simone Vered the issue of grace, right? That it is precisely in this moment of total affliction and distance that grace is possible, right? And so on 127, it says on God can never be perfectly present to us here below on account of our flesh, but he can be almost perfectly absent from us in extreme affliction.
Yes, right.
This is the only possibility of perfection for us on earth.
Right, okay.
And then further down...
So I think I was saying that just in slightly different terms, that grace is what's opened up to consciousness when you become aware of that.
But grace is only possible for her in complete emptiness and distance. And this is, I think, she brings in, I think, the entire, her detour into the mystical literature and the whole point of detachment, so that emptiness is necessary, she says, is oftentimes for grace to come in, for God to fill you. So you have to be afflicted, whatever that, affliction as emptiness. As a hole in you, so but driven by the nail.
All right, so the question that I have to ask, so that's a Jewish person asking a Christian person, ultimately, is whether that form of kenosis or emptiness is whether that type of affliction and emptiness opens one to a love of a divine. Now, she doesn't simply say it's a flooding back of love, the way some of the Eastern mystics would say. For her, it seems to me, at any rate, that one becomes aware of a strange form of love that is infused with the providential determinacy of the Greek tragedian world. Now, if it was just the way you described it, one could easily, I think, assimilate it to all the great Christian mystics. So I think that's part of it, but it's not. I'm not sure it's the whole of it for her, and that's what also makes it very strange that God's love is the force of nature itself as it's flowing through. Or maybe I don't understand.
Yeah, but I think there is. I think this one. Yeah. I see where there is different ways. I think she says you construe this providence. No, I think one way can end up in evil. The universe where we are living and of which we form a tiny particle is the distance put by love between God and God. We are a point in this distance. Space, time, and the mechanism that governs matter are the distance. Everything that we call evil is only this mechanism. So if you take this one way to approach God through the providence and to construe this scaffolding, but then God has provided that when His grace penetrates to the very center of man and from there illuminates all his being, He's able to walk on the water without violating.
So what is the consciousness that grace gives, that we become aware of? Is it that love infuses in a blind way, blind necessity? That is God's loving grace? I ask that as a question.
I want to get on this because, so I found this text extremely troubling as a Catholic, and I don't understand how we can say it's a Catholic position to talk of blind necessity in a world where we're just sort of floating as puppets. I mean, if we're participating in the divine mind and looking in creation, we can see God in creation, right? So I can see divine providence as to talk about a mechanical world where it's just our position, like no matter what, we have obedience to this world, and it's just our position towards it, or our desire for the obedience. That doesn't sound, I mean, it's kind of maybe small to say it's Catholic or not Catholic, but I was very troubled with that, and I didn't feel that that was did anyone else have this experience, or I mean, am I just kind of, I mean, it's the blind necessity, that doesn't sound like the creation or...
The blind necessity of not, I think her fear is not to take providence as an idolatry and construe a theodicy. That's one. And the second is that I think for her, in a very radical, probably disturbing manner, this notion of dereliction, affliction, the one phase of it is that's the grace of God there. In that, it's only in that absence that you are aware of grace. Grace cannot come as it's not a surplus, it's not an addition. It is, I mean, the image you use of the nail that is put into that makes space for
That's
the receptivity.
The only place for the grace to come in is through that nail. I mean, that doesn't sound, that seems troubling to me, but sorry, I'm struggling with this.
I want to make sure that you both have to, okay?
Can, under that theory, human beings induce grace? In other words, affliction comes to all of us. And what you're saying to me is that if I have affliction and I'm aware of it, I can bring God's grace to me. And I thought, as a Jew, that the Christian view of grace was one that was bestowed without human effort, irrationally. And if that's true, is Simone Weil saying that I can induce grace once affliction has come to me by awareness? In which case, I think she's very close to Nemo, who basically is saying, if I can see where I'm empty, I can appreciate that there's evil on the part of God. They seem to me they go together, but the thing that disturbs me is that it's disturbing my predisposition to think that grace is something that man cannot control under Christian theology. Am I off the deep end?
Yeah, they cannot control. I don't think.
But if she says you can do it once you get afflicted, can't you control it?
So maybe she's a different way or different side of Nemo, but not taking it into the Marcionite way, but bringing in this very powerful notion of grace.
As human-induced, once the awareness of affliction.
Not human, precisely God-induced, as you say.
God-induced through human awareness.
The blind necessity is a form of grace if you can come to that consciousness.
Yeah.
And you only come to that consciousness through this absolute dereliction and letting go through that pain.
Yeah.
When your world is destroyed and you realize that there's nothing but God. And that becomes a crucifixion of the soul, which I guess in her sense is this revelation of God's loving care. When you can I think,
when you can relocate yourself within that blend of love and necessity. You have to get your head around the notion of what that providential love is, this blind force of existence, and that is the way God cares for the world. I think that's what she...
That's the side we see, right? The question is, how do you mediate the distance which is there?
Right. Well, I don't think she's saying that you can mediate the distance.
Yeah.
You can. You move from suffering to affliction when you enter into that depth that your world is destroyed, that you can't mediate this, and that this is the space in which God enters the soul.
I mean, she specifically says that
But it's not the God. It's a God of a very strange love.
God has to take the steps. Like she specifically
Yeah.
says that there's no steps.
Yeah. Yeah, because how do you mediate the distance? You can construe, let's say, a theology of nature. You can have a theodicy to explain, but I think she's aware and as we saw in Job, that's never sufficient. It doesn't lead you anywhere. So, it's this.
Right. Anybody else want to come in on this before we? So you, in a certain sense, Adrian, you've rehabilitated her back into a certain Christian framework, a deeper Christian framework, where there's the mystery of tribulation is something related to divine love. In a way that surprises, that emerges authentically out of the Christian tradition, although Sarah Jo doesn't recognize it
I think she's
as a Catholic.
As I read Simone Weil, I think she's broader than the Christian tradition.
Yeah, I think so too. But it's, but she ultimately writes this to her father confessor. So it is a certain kind of statement of her spiritual position. It's a testimony. Right. Anybody else want to pick on this?
I'm also speaking out of her essays, Gravity and Grey. I mean, that's where I think it really helps to shed light on this.
So then the third possibility that we saw with Soloveitchik is that for him there are two forms of divine communication or instruction to the human being. And it swings between two poles. One pole is God's communication through the cosmos, through its order and harmony, which is greater than a natural order and harmony. It opens the consciousness to wonder and wisdom, and part of the human task is to participate in that in all forms of creative ways, to reinforce that wonder and harmony. And then there's another form of communication for people who can't perceive that or who need to be shocked out of a certain lethargy or need to be brought to a different consciousness. And it's another form of divine communication, which is not the revelation of God through the cosmos and the harmony of nature, but the revelation of God through the whirlwind, through the dark terror. And so that dark terror is a revelation that comes to Abraham in Genesis 15, when he's thrown into the darkness of the night. It's a whirlwind that comes as well at Sinai for him, and because it has a covenantal communication, and it's a whirlwind that comes to Job, who had been, in a certain sense, trapped by the complacency of the life that he had been living. So for Soloveitchik, there is a communication of God through what he calls nihility, or the nihil. Or he also calls the apocalyptic, or he calls it the covenantal. That is to say, God also communicates with a terror and force that makes the human being aware that they are truly nothing and that they don't understand anything, and that God is unknowable, and that within the space of that shocking ultimacy of unknowing, there can become, for Soloveitchik, what he would call a cathartic redemption. That is to say, you try to internalize that new consciousness and realization, which is a breaking down, in a sense, of hubris, a revealing of what he calls the non-being. You're opened up to a deeper emptiness, and it enables a new spiritual consciousness. So he distinguishes between pain and suffering. Pain is just pain. Suffering is a spiritual orientation that becomes aware of our place in the vast scheme of the universe. It's the place of the cosmic communication to ask questions like why. We ask why when we're talking about the nature of the universe and its mystery and its cosmic order for Soloveitchik. And this allows one to be spurred towards higher forms of scientific and artistic creativity. It's a kind of wonder that induces our attempt to bring harmony and peace and order and even solve problems in the world. The response for Soloveitchik to the covenantal breaking in, or this apocalyptic rupture, or this covenantal shock, when God speaks to the world. So there are two ways that God communicates. In this second one, the response to the covenant is not why, but in a certain sense, it is what do I do to live with dignity with this new consciousness? So for him, dignity is the task of the human being who can hold it together in a new cathartic way. So that turns pain into suffering because it requires a certain consciousness. So for him, he uses the sense of cathartic. It's a redemptive suffering because it brings one to a new ability to withstand the tasks of the world with a certain form of redemptive dignity. From his point of view, one doesn't then ask anything of God. It's not a question of saying, why is this happening to me? It's a communication of God to bring you to a certain kind of consciousness. Right? And then you have to do something with it. So for him, there are two faces to the divine revelation that are both intended to instruct. So we'll leave aside this notion. He makes a distinction between the actual topical halacha and the thematic halacha, right? So from an abstract thematic point of view, and he says he can't communicate that as a rabbi to people who are suffering, but he says from an abstract point of view, thematic halacha, and he follows Maimonides, is that there's no evil. Everything God created and everything is good. From top to bottom, insofar as it is in being, it is good. We only think evil when we compare it with lesser forms to higher forms. He says that's, in his experience, no help to anybody who's suffering. But nevertheless, he claims that it's true from the point of view of thematic, abstract halacha. Topical halacha is totally engaged with the suffering of human beings, and that the forms of lived halachic law are forms which are constantly taking awareness of the suffering and brokenness of the human being. And how a person does that with dignity is the covenantal task. So from his point of view, as a certain type of rabbinic thinker who is thoroughly trained in Western thought, but is also very traditional in some ways, Scripture preserves for us two types of divine instruction. So to accept Soloveitchik's position, and this is sort of where I slightly buckle, to accept that position, you have to say that the entire Scripture is one multifaceted truth. And there are times that God communicates in one way, through the visible, tangible, orderly world, And there are other ways that God communicates through the whirlwind. And that these are different forms of divine attempts to instruct and teach and guide humankind. Okay? So, although he doesn't say it in those two terms, that's what you have to believe if you're going to believe the truth of what he's saying. That God is reaching out to communicate through the revelation that is mediated by Scripture, and it happens through two ways. So Scripture tells us one way is cosmic consciousness, another way is the teaching through the whirlwind. That witness in Scripture helps you understand something in the natural or experiential world. That these are two forms of divine address. Two ways that deal with you. On the one hand, the cosmic consciousness appeals to the side of the human being, God as majesty. And so it appeals to that part of the human psyche which is majestic. Right? It's the human being that walks on two legs, that has a head that reaches up to heaven, that thinks thoughts, that creates, that builds society, that solves problems. The majesty of the universe and its order corresponds to that majesty of the rational. And God has helped you understand that in the world by the witness of Scripture, from Soloveitchik's point of view. On the other hand, there is the absconditus and there is the nihil of the human being that falls on their knees in pain, that dies dust to dust, and doesn't just stand on the earth. And it's not just majestic, but is nihilized by the world, being of flesh and blood. And you have to be conscious of that. So the voice from the whirlwind is the teaching of God. So it's both and. It's push-pull. If you go to one extreme, you pervert the other side. And so sometimes God communicates as one way or the other to bring a person into different types of consciousness. So he's less concerned with talking about theodicy in the sense of why does God do this to a person. God wants to create a deeper level of a religious anthropology. And the deepest religious anthropology deals with the majesty of God, which is the majesty of the human being, and the brokenness of the human being, which requires a different form of communication. Okay? And so from his point of view, these are two types of communication of which Scripture is a witness in communication, and which is embodied in the halacha. So for his point of view as an Orthodox rabbi, the halacha or the law keeps one in touch with both sides, the majesty and the humbleness of the human being. And different parts of the self swing back and forth between celebration and creativity and awareness of mortality and impotence and so on. So he's filled with a very powerful swing between these two. So his personality was also this kind of raw dialectic, different, let us say, than Simone Weil, but and he sees this as something of the divine structure of being. So you have to, then I'll just cut. So the point where I am hesitant is there is a belief in a certain intentional communication. It's not just that I learn from the fragments of existence blowing up as the whirlwind, right? The world is not just that cosmos blowing up in my face. It's God coming in the storm, hidden deeply and unseeable, but communicating through that whirlwind. Okay? That is where his theological position has to be understood. It's not that I look at the universe and it's blown to smithereens and I have to come to another level of consciousness. It's another form of divine communication. Okay?
Did you say that, so on the one hand there's the majesty of God, and then correspondingly the majesty of human beings. For the brokenness of God, is there also brokenness of God?
No, there is this, God is what corresponds to our unknowing is the unknowability of God. So the brokenness of the person is the breaking open of the presumption of knowledge. Right? And the vast unknowability of God, or that God is beyond everything that can be said about being. He says that at one point. It's is something of that absconditus, not Deus revelatus, but Deus absconditus. Aware of that darkness, taken inside, is awareness of the darkness, the dark night of the soul of not knowing. Okay? So it's not the broken suffering of God in that sense. Yeah.
But does he not concede that there has to be a balance between these two forms of encountering? And
it's very hard to say. My own understanding is that the human being swings between powerful poles. I think ultimately, if he took a Maimonidean position, it would be a balancing point. But I don't think that that's the fullness of Rabbi Soloveitchik. I think he had a polar personality in that sense. These heights and depths. And that both are true as extreme truths. There are places in a Maimonidean or Aristotelian sense where you have to find the mean and the balance point. But those may be ways that you negotiate the world, but they're not the truth of the majesty as opposed to the hiddenness, okay? So in other words, he's also trying to create two theological poles which reflect two types of religious anthropology. And insofar as I understand that they are these polar aspects that relate. So now let me, what can we take away from all of this? Or what would I like to take away from this? I'll make a kind of, and then I'd like to raise it in terms of the statement that Levinas raised towards Nemo. Is there a way that we can move forward that gives us some insight or some perception that is not simply a recapitulation of the same with a capital S? That was Levinas's terms. Right? Levinas was trying to find how do you break towards transcendence so that everything that we say as explanation is not a re-saying of what has been said. That it's not simply a moving around of all of these pieces. Within the framework of the fact that for the time being, we're suspending the notion of what the Jewish and Christian tradition would understand to be that answer. That is to say, God breaks in with a revealed word. That comes from another, that is not the same, right? But when we're looking up from the bottom upward, we're wondering, can we have any purchase on the mystery of things, even the mystery of God, that's not a re-saying of the same? That is to say, that you never escape the cognitive helmet that you put on to think in the first place. And that you're simply reassembling that. So that becomes, that's why he says at one point that anytime you want to explain God within the framework of the world, it's theodicy. So theodicy is always taking the pieces and moving them around from within what you have. So he says, from his point of view, theodicy is every time you want to talk about God within the space of the world. And to try to find. So what I'm trying to find, is there a way that we could break through that may take us a little bit farther? Something, perhaps, of what Job is hinting at when he says, I've seen God with the seeing of the eye. Or I've heard of God, but now my eye sees. Something of a new perception that's not just the same of the hearing, right? That there is a perceiving, that he sees something of the limit that had not been known. Something that opens up his mind to a new pure perception that's not just reason. Okay? Or let me put it slightly differently, and so I want to slightly radicalize and try to perhaps go a step behind the Heideggerian perception, right? So at one level, the always already is the always already of the mind, right? You're always already within the framework of the mind that you think. From a Heideggerian point of view, there's something deeper that is opened up by an anxiety that throws you into the reality of the nothing, of nothingness. But it is a state of anxiety which has a certain kind of tenor about it, right? There's a certain quality about it. So the question that I want to ask, is there something that may precede that? Or that's what I'm going to try to wager in the next 5 or 10 minutes. That there may be something that's before the always already of mind or anxiety, which would be that first bursting into consciousness of something. So for Heidegger's point of view, is there something that precedes the always already of thinking? Right? Yeah. And so I'm going to wonder now out loud about this, and I think about 5 minutes, then we'll open this up. So I'm going to try to make some new thoughts, but for those who have read parts of my Sacred Attunement, there's some things that are there, and so if you're interested, you can check on that. But I'm going to try to reformulate this in a slightly different way from the perspective of what we've been doing from the book of Job. Okay? So I'm not making any claims more than this is my attempt to kind of move forward from that question. So the way I would want to first begin to say, using the terms that we used from the very beginning, is that in the tremendum may be born what I would like to call the mysterium. In the tremendum may be born the mysterium that lives and remains in the heart of the tremendum. That is to say, the mysterium that lives in the tremendum which has broken open all categories. Because the tremendum transcends all categories. It's a breaking open of categories. The mysterium is something that's livable. Is there a way that the tremendum can give birth to the mysterium so that the mysterium remains in the heart of the tremendum and doesn't forget it? So that you can live the perception in a certain and new way. So let me try to clarify what I'm saying abstractly. So my starting point would be, and this we can think about the book of Job or personal experience, is that when something of the depth opens up, which we could call the rupture, or in the book I called the caesura. There's a kind of radical breaking open of the world that we normally inhabit. Because we always start with the always already of the world that we're in. So the question is, you can't go back to a pure origin. How can you find something in the space of the world that can reground you in a new way of moving forward? So what I'd like to suggest is that what happens when the rupture or the caesura happens is that the mind faces or is filled with an empty given. That the mind is filled with a pure suchness. That is to say, there is no thought that immediately emerges at that crisis moment when things have broken open. I don't think thought, and I don't think correlation between one thing and another. But somehow for a fragmentary second, or maybe even longer, something of the pure possibility of the emptied mind has happened. Right? It's not something that's flooded with thought, and it's not something that's flooded with anxiety. It's simply a stripping and an opening. And it's not even a divestment because it hasn't happened, but it's a radical rupture and disclosure of pure suchness as such. The phenomenological correlation of that, I would suggest, is silence. That what's opened up in this space is silence. A fullness of silence, an immeasurable awareness, which is silence, and whose response is silence. And that this silence has to be leveraged back into the soul. So that silence is the trace of that rupture. That silence then, in consciousness, somehow is deeply leveraged into the soul, so that silence precedes, endures within, continues alongside, and follows everything that's sayable. It's as if one could hear the silence within the spaces of the vocables of speech. The silence that precedes, the silence that endures underneath it, the silence to which it opens up to after the saying. Something of that silence, I'm suggesting, is the trace in terms of the spiritual character of the human being of what has opened up from the point of view of this breaking open of rupture. Because there has to be some kind of, I'm trying to find some correlate that emerges into the heart of the human being, which is not, let us say, thought, and is not anxiety. It's not the fear of death. It's some kind of enduring awareness of the suchness as such, which is correlated with what we call silence. Okay? So this condition of silence, which is the suchness as such, becomes the radical mystery of the all. From the tremendum, there emerges a radical mystery of the all. Now here I want to make two kinds of points, and this is where I'm slightly leaning on what we've learned in Job. From one point of view, and this is my own attempt to kind of move forward with this, from one point of view, what Job perceives when he sees what we talked about the ostriching and the raven and the bird and all those doing, he perceives something of what perhaps Spinoza spoke about as the conatus essendi, the essential thrust and drive of the different forms of existence being the form of existence which they are. So that the first awareness, we may say, of the mystery that arises to consciousness of this tremendum is what Job says, that he relents of the forms of consciousness that reconstructed how he wanted to see the forms of existence in relationship to his own personal life, and he tries to attune himself to the mystery of the way they fill and flood all of being. So that is to say, there's a kind of wonder at the mystery of the vastness of the measures to which a human being has to be attuned by allowing us to somehow become aware of their conatus, their own essential way of being and enduring and struggling and trying to preserve themselves. So that's the first level of attunement. The first attunement, we may say, is this attunement of breaking down the categories that I try to determine what existence is, and I see them as an infinite series of flowings that I stand in marvel at, right? That is the mysterium that has emerged out of the tremendum. And that's the first meaning that we saw of Job when he says, I relent of the categories that I had prior constructed, because now in silence I am able to see them flowing across my consciousness in a new way. So what then is different about a human being than an ostrich? Or the wild horse? Or all the animals that we saw of their conatus essendi? So of course, we want to eat and live and endure. But I think that the book of Job opens us up to something else. There is something about the human being that can pause in the infinite space of being and reattune oneself to it with sympathetic care. Because we're also people who can transcend, perhaps, our simple drive to existence to save another person, to do a certain deed. There's something that transforms the human self from all other creatures, or in a different way than other creatures, by its ability to disrupt itself from its need to survive. The deed that is done for another person at one's own expense, or the care that goes beyond what one needs for oneself for the other. That becomes part of that second meaning of nechama which is sympathy and spiritual care. In other words, there's one point in which there is wonder, and there's another kind of attunement. It's a second order attunement. The primary attunement is just the drive of the conatus to be and endure. But human beings can disrupt that. They can save someone, first responders. They can give. They can give love at the expense of one's own benefit. There's something mysterious about the graciousness. It's grace. There's a graciousness of human love that takes one beyond the conatus of nature. And that begins to open the self towards a willful disruption. The first rupture just happens through the tremendum. The mystery of the human being is that they can open up a new interruption in existence by being able to transcend their natural need by doing something spiritual that transcends nature. It's not always the ethical, but it transfigures nature. It requires a pause, an intentional interruption, a new way of attuning and aligning the self, not just to the mystery that's flowing, but to the particular gravitas of myself in relationship to that other person or being that's there. So to a certain extent, this attempt, this ability to transcend conatus is our capacity to act morally. Without forgetting the silence out of which it emerges. Right? So, from a hermeneutical point of view, the first hermeneutical response of the attunement is simply reading the world as it inscribes itself through all the features of nature that disclose themselves before our eye. We have to read it, right? But we try to read it as neutrally as possible. The second hermeneutical level, which arises out of the intentional interruption, is conscious of the way that we attune ourselves ethically towards other kinds of features of existence with a heightened consciousness that we are bringing a certain level of ethical plus to the world into that silence, that the silence has not been forgotten. In other words, it's not native or given as such, but it's something that we add from the gift of God who created us, but it's something that we add back into the world with consciousness. It's not something from nothing, but it's something that's added into that, and the consciousness that it emerges into that never forgotten silence means that I have to be aware of every second order attunement of how I relate to everything. That I am now responsible for that. That's the second level of nechama, which is the compassionate level. The first is the relenting of the presumption of knowledge. Remember, there was that double facing of I have nechama, the joke says. I despise myself, or I despise this because now I have a realization that human beings have overreached themselves because I have a new knowledge of the silence. And then there's a second level of this compassion that I reach, and that's where Job, as we saw, immediately was able to forgive the friends. And then he reached beyond where he was. That was that essential moment that allowed him to regain a world, because he forgave his friends. And that re-engaged him with the social world. So this, let me make a couple of other points that we'll open up. This is a kind of raising the mind through silence to a holy wonder. And it's a way of moving towards a transfiguration of nature through that pause which has emerged through silence. So now I want to share with you for me, one of the most powerful teachings that appear in the Zohar, the book. I've said it once before and Adrian has heard it, but I'll say it again. So there is the question that's asked in the Zohar, which is the canonical book of medieval Jewish mysticism, is what made the golden calf an idol? What turned something in nature into an idol? Okay. And the answer is very interesting. So the beginning of the teaching turns consciousness to the passage in Isaiah, which says, "Raise your eyes to the heavens and see who created these things." Now, the word "who" in Hebrew is me. But in the paradoxical sense of mysticism, the "who" is an epithet of God. The notion of wonder is one of God's names. So it's wonder that has created these things, which is Ele. To raise your eyes and see who, the me, which is obviously referring to God, has created these things. Now the Zohar then makes this astonishing correlation. So it says that when you look at the end of Genesis 2, it says that these, the Ele, are the generations of the heavens and the earth. It's only referring to the world of nature. It's only referring to the world of nature. And if you go back and you look at Exodus 32, when it talks about what Aaron and others said when they made the golden calf, they said, Ele, these are the gods that took you out of the land of Egypt. So what does the Zohar then say? What the people who made the golden calf forgot was the word me. They forgot the issue of wonder, which is an epithet of God. One of God's names in the Zohar is wonder. It's just the mystery of wonder. And when they made the golden calf, they said, these are the gods that took you out of Egypt. These, as we saw in Genesis 2, simply refers to the natural world. But if you combine the natural world, which is Ele, with the mystery of God, which is me, you get the name Elohim, which is the name of God.
Wow, that's nice.
So God becomes the transfiguration of the natural through the spiritual consciousness of wonder. Right? It's an astonishing perception. If you take away the wonder, you simply have the facticity of nature. And so what I'm suggesting in this particular case is the need to raise the mind beyond nature is to infuse it with this holiness of wonder, which is God, which is God's name. Because wonder is God's name. Me becomes, for the spiritual sense, a name of God. And when you infuse that back into nature, it transforms the primary order of being, the primary orders, which is simply the natural order, into something spiritual, which is already there in potentia, but it has to be transformed through consciousness. right? So that me becomes that mysterium that has arisen out of the silence from the tremendum. And and when that has been reinfused in the soul, one can then come back to the world of nature and infuse it